Orders of the day. Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We wish to call Government Order G141, please.
Order G141, resuming the debate adjourned on December 5th, 2013, on the motion for second reading of Bill 141, an act to enact the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act 2013.
Further debate? The member from Kitch. The debate? Member from Newmarket Aurora.
Thank you, Speaker. I first of all want to thank members of the Legislature for agreeing to have my lead-off on this bill deferred, and I have been looking forward to participating in debate on Bill 141.
Member?
Sir, I have to confirm that this is your lead-off.
Speaker, you might check with the clerk, but it is my lead-off, yes.
That's precisely what I'm doing, but I was asked to make sure that because of the stand-down, this was it. So the clock will stop and reset. The member from Newmarket Aurora on the lead.
Thank you, Speaker. I am pleased to participate in this, my lead-off on debate of Bill 141, an act to enact the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act 2013. Well, Speaker, there were a number of issues that I raised in the very few minutes that I had when the minister introduced this bill, and I indicated at that time, in fact, I had asked for unanimous consent for the government to allow me some more time than the 30 seconds that I had to actually respond. That was denied by the government. And so, fortunately, we're now here, and I'd ask those watching by parliamentary channel to settle in, because we're in for an hour's debate here, and I do commit to take my full hour, because there's a great deal to be said about this issue and the important priority that infrastructure should have with the Government of Ontario. The member opposite has already started his heckling, the Liberal member, and I haven't even started. And although we can't name members, in Mr. Zimmerman, who
I can,
and I'll leave that to you, Speaker. And so we have a bill here that, according to the minister when he made his introductory remarks, is to establish a mechanism to encourage principled, evidence-based and strategic long-term infrastructure planning for the province of Ontario. He indicated that underlying this legislation was the objective to support job creation and training opportunities, economic growth and protection of the environment, and to incorporate design excellence into infrastructure planning. I want to say at the very outset, Speaker, that I and my colleagues in the official opposition fully support every one of those principles. And I will be the first one to say that I believe when it comes to the important issue of infrastructure in this province, that this is a policy that should be beyond politics. I have said for many years that when it comes to making a commitment to an infrastructure project, assuming that it has been planned and prioritized properly, that once the decision has been made to invest in that infrastructure project, that it should be beyond political interference from that point on. That there should be no such thing as a stop and start of these programs, which is why we have a serious problem in the province of Ontario today, that whether it was transit, whether it was the construction of roads, the minute that a new administration came into office, and whether that was at the provincial level, whether it was at the federal level or municipal level, that now the political tug-of-war started to take place, and those who had the strongest voice in terms of, I don't want that project in my backyard, or I think that it's more important to build a transitway here rather than there. What took place in this province and continues to take place is that those with the loudest voices get heard, and important infrastructure projects are stalled. And so we can talk as much as we want in this place on behalf of our constituents and argue that gridlock is our top priority until we get to the point here in this legislature of putting in place legislation that actually will lift the decisions about whether those infrastructure projects get implemented, get built and financed in the long term without interference, will continue to fail the people of this province. And so I want to speak to one issue to start that the minister has raised in this bill, which I agree with, and that's the need for long-term planning for infrastructure. In his bill, the minister made reference to the importance of having an inventory of our infrastructure assets in this province. I agree. In fact, he makes reference to the fact that infrastructure planning and investment should take into account, of course, applicable budgets or fiscal plans. He indicates in this legislation that the planning and investment should take a long-term view. Decision makers should take into account the needs of Ontarians by being mindful of, among other things, demographic and economic trends. He indicated that it's important that infrastructure planning and investment should foster innovation by creating opportunities to make use of innovative technologies, services and practices, particularly where doing so would utilize technology, techniques and practices developed in Ontario. Again, fully support the objective that the minister has set out in this legislation. But I want to talk about the issue of the inventory of our assets. Speaker, we cannot make an intelligent decision and a responsible decision about which infrastructure projects should be prioritized if we don't know the existing infrastructure inventory, its state of repair or disrepair. It's very easy, Speaker, whether it's a provincial politician or politicians at the local municipal level, when an announcement is made that new infrastructure funds will be available, it's very easy to immediately identify the high-profile projects within the community, within the province, that will give us the biggest bang for our buck politically. And so all too often, when announcements are made for new infrastructure funding, we default to announcing or prioritizing a project within our community that's going to give the biggest public relations kick to us, that we can cut the ribbons on, that we can get the accolades, and particularly if we're nearing the crazy season called elections. As we all know, the closer we get to an election, the more compromising the decisions can become, not in terms of what is the most important infrastructure project, but what is the most important politically beneficial project for me. And so we hear about the infrastructure deficit in this province. We know that under the streets of the city of Toronto or any other municipality in the GTA and across the province, there is an invisible infrastructure that is being ignored by far too many who have been placed in positions of responsibility to ensure that that important infrastructure is protected. Speaker, I'm talking about the pipes that deliver the drinking water to our communities. I'm talking about the wastewater management system that is invisible, that is underground, that we count on. And the only time that there's real evidence that that infrastructure, that invisible infrastructure, is being ignored is when we have circumstances such as happened in the city of Toronto just within the last few months, where we see systems backing up, people's basements and homes filling up with water. Why? Because that invisible infrastructure has been neglected and it's incapable of handling those issues, those storms that may only happen once every 50 years, maybe only once every 100 years. But that's why long-term planning is important, and that's why people get elected, to make those decisions. And yes, it may be that sometimes that new library, as nice as it would be to be able to construct that new library, sometimes the decision may have to be made by that council, by the Ministry of the provincial government, or by the Ministry of the federal government, that no, that project is not a priority in your community because we have evidence that there is a crumbling infrastructure that should in fact be prioritized. We have example here in the City of Toronto. We hear what's happening to the Gardiner Expressway. A lot of debate. Here's what's disturbing about that one particular infrastructure investment. We have it on good authority that hundreds of millions of dollars have over the years in fact been put aside for the maintenance of that important piece of infrastructure, and millions of dollars have not been spent on in fact maintaining it. And so we're now in a crisis situation. And what could have cost us a few million to properly maintain it over the years is now going to be a multi-million and perhaps billion-dollar problem that we have to address. Well, how do we deal with it? Well, the minister, rightfully, I want to commend him for making reference to asset management. We have had the discussion. What concerns me is that the legislation that we have before us speaks about it in a broad framework sense, but there is nothing here that is substantive that is going to change anything after this legislation is passed from the circumstances we have today. We have talked for years in this legislature about the importance of asset management. Everybody agrees that it's important, to the credit of the Ministry of Transportation. A number of years ago, they partnered with the Good Roads Association to put in place an asset management program, primarily focused on bridges in the province. The ministry invested, I understand currently the investment is up to some $750,000. Good Roads has made their contribution and is managing that process. There are a number of municipalities that are part of that. Here is the problem. I also understand that Good Roads has now had a number of meetings with certainly the former minister. I believe they've met with the current minister as well, twice. I have made a written submission to the minister as well, supporting Good Roads in their request for additional funding to ensure that that asset management program is fully extended across the province, is made available to all municipalities and is expanded beyond the asset of bridges, because the same principle, the same platform can be used for other infrastructure assets in our province. Unless something's changed since the last time I've had communication on this, the ministry has essentially shut that file down from the standpoint of saying there's no more money, we're not going to carry on. Well, Speaker, that's our problem. There are partial solutions. It's not that people in this province, whether it's municipalities or whether it's professionals, whether it's politicians, there's never an issue in most cases of understanding what the problem is and what the solution is. The big gap exists between making the pronouncement and developing a solution and actually implementing it. That's the problem. We have, in the case of asset management, a strong organization that is province-wide that is willing to take the lead. We have the technology, and all that is missing is the minister stepping in and saying, yes, we will fund this in the same way that there has to be a long-term 10-year plan for infrastructure. The asset management program that underlies that infrastructure program also has to be part of that long-term planning. But, Minister, along with planning comes providing the resources. What we can't do is mandate an asset management program and then say to the municipalities, well, you have to pay for it. I believe this should be a partnership, and the partnership should be the federal government, the provincial government, and municipalities. But it is only the province of Ontario that can, through legislation, make an asset management program mandatory. And I'm advising the minister that I will be bringing forward an amendment to his legislation that will, in fact, add that word mandatory into the legislation so that it actually has some teeth. I believe that that is so fundamental to dealing with the infrastructure crisis that we have in the province of Ontario that I'm going to appeal to the minister, to my colleagues on all sides of the House, to look at this very, very seriously. If there's anything that we do in this legislature over the next number of months to ensure that the province of Ontario will be properly served by us on the infrastructure file, it will be that we put in place a mandatory asset management program province-wide that will apply not only to municipal infrastructure assets, but provincial infrastructure assets as well. Speaker, I'd like to move on to another issue, and that is the legislation dealing with the issue of the long-term plan. I struggle with this. Again, as I say, I support the minister's initiative, and I support what is in this legislation when it talks about the importance of putting in place a 10-year strategy and a 10-year infrastructure plan. What is puzzling to me is why it's going to take 3 years to put a 10-year plan in place. I don't know what this government has been doing for the last 10 years. We've had proclamation after proclamation now from 3 different ministers who have had responsibility for this file. And they talk about putting in place a long-term plan. They talk about putting in place reliable and sustainable funding for infrastructure. And here we are, 10 years later. Once again, we have a document, we have a legislative framework that is telling us it's important to have a 10-year plan, but the government is saying it'll take them 3 years to put the 10-year plan together. Now, who isn't frustrated by that? How can we blame our municipal partners for being cynical about what goes on here and what is being proclaimed in this place? Perhaps the public can be fooled by headlines. And this government has been so good at redrafting press releases, at restaging public announcements, at marching their ministers out into wonderful backdrops to make another pronouncement that was made 2 years before, 2 years before that, 2 years before that, and you know, it's like it's news all over again.
But it never happens.
But it never happens.
New ministry.
Not a shovel in the ground. Speaker, I'm not sure how to deal with this because, and my friends in the press gallery are not going to be happy with me for this, see, because I don't understand why the media isn't holding the government to account every time they get a press release that they know full well the only thing that's been changed is the date and the name of the minister. Why is it not that the press gallery holds these people accountable and exposes them for what's going on? The only reason the public isn't holding the government to account is because they're too busy to do that kind of work. They're too busy to keep track of where those announcements were and when they took place and under whose ministers' names that old announcement was uncovered and represented and repackaged and respun. With all due respect, I'm going to challenge our press gallery to do some research on the announcements from the Minister of Infrastructure, from the Minister of Transportation, and his predecessors. And it'll be quite some revealing exercise. What have we been getting? What have we been getting for our investment in government for the last 10 years, other than a bunch of retreaded announcements that have made things ever worse for us? So what is it going to take? Well, I think it'll take holding this government to account. I am hoping that the leader of the third party is serious. I read in the media this morning that Ms. Horwath has sent a letter to the Premier essentially drawing a line in the sand and saying, I want to put you on notice that we're not going to play this game anymore. And you know, I don't agree with probably most of what Andrea Horwath wants to do to this province in terms of giving the till away and spending money we don't have. But here's what I do agree with her on. This is from the Toronto Star. And by the way, I tried to get a copy of Ms. Horwath's letter today before the debate, and I was told that they're still reformatting it. So as soon as I get it, I'll share it with you. But obviously the Toronto Star had it before anyone else did. I'm not sure how that happens, but here's what the Toronto Star said the NDP leader wrote. Do any members of the NDP have a copy of their leader's letter?
Well, we didn't bring it with us.
They don't, Speaker. So
We've seen it. We've read it. It's a good letter.
here's what the Toronto Star said the leader wrote. I will not support any new taxes, tolls or fees that hit middle-class families. You know what? Quite frankly, I think people in this province are overtaxed. And when we look at the waste that this government has allowed to take place under their watch over the last 10 years, Speaker, and whether the Minister of Health just identified herself here. She didn't like where I'm going because she knows full well that what I'm going to say is that one of those areas of waste, lack of accountability, lack of transparency is her own file, the orange file. She also won't like the fact that we know that that kind of waste continues in another one of her files, the e-health file. And we also know that if, in fact, the Auditor General were to check up on any other area of department in her ministry, he would find that there are other multi-millions of dollars of waste taking place because of a lack of oversight, a lack of accountability, and a lack of transparency. And we know that that's taking place across this government. So our position is no, Madam Wynne. You don't immediately knee-jerk go back into the pockets of hard-working taxpayers in this province. What you do, first of all, is you line your ministers up and you say, do your job on behalf of the people of this province, be accountable, ensure that your ministry is doing its job, be accountable to the taxpayers, and then you go to your bureaucrats and you say, be accountable, and by the way, if you're not, there are consequences. And what should happen, based on the evidence, is that the whole bunch of the ministers should resign. They should then ask their deputies to resign and their assistant deputies to resign and keep going until you get to the point where people in this province and the bureaucrats in this government actually understand that there is accountability and that there will be consequences for people who don't do their job. But that isn't the way this government does business, Speaker. Here's what they do. Well, it's just another billion. It's just another billion. We'll shuffle the chairs. We'll move one minister to the other. And you see, they consider that's very funny, right? I would suggest, Speaker, that the government House Leader, whose job is to defend the indefensible every day in this House. Why? Because the ministers are afraid to stand up on their own 2 feet and defend themselves. And so it defers to the government House Leader, and the people of this province are getting tired of this, to get up and read his speaking notes that say nothing about the issue, that continue to deflect what is important to the people of this province, and that is that their tax dollars are treated with respect. That the people who work for them in the government of Ontario do so with accountability. That ministers of this government take responsibility. There has not been a minister in this government that has shown any sense of remorse for what has taken place in their ministry, wasting multi-millions of tax dollars. And Speaker, in the meantime, what have we got? Back in our constituency offices, we are dealing with families who are being told by ministers of the Crown, I'm sorry, there's not enough money to ensure that your autistic child has the kind of support and care that they need. We're being told in our constituency offices by families and by seniors that now essential home care that was provided for them in their retirement homes, that was provided for them in their own homes through home care, seniors' homes, long-term care homes, are calling us in our constituency office saying, we're being told that essential home care services can no longer be continued. And they're being asked to help the government by rationing the kind of home care support services that they're getting. We're being told that people in our constituencies who are in desperate needs of cancer care drugs are being told no, we're not going to make a political decision about saving your life. We're going to leave that to a bureaucratic organization, and if it means that you're being told you can't have the life-saving cancer care drug, then so be it, because we're doing the honorable thing as government by not interfering. Speaker, the last time I looked, you and I got elected by people in our ridings to advocate for them, to intervene for them on the issues that matter to them. And when it gets to the point where government ministers and backbenchers who often don't have the courage to stand up for their constituents against the ministers who they know are doing the wrong thing, when it gets to that point, we know that we have a government that has lost the trust and the confidence and the authority to be there. And I believe the day is coming very soon when the people in this province will have an opportunity to make a decision about whether or not the kind of excuses, the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, whether they want that type of government to continue. It's a rhetorical question. I don't have to answer it. We heard a poll as recently as this morning, 70% of the people in this province believe that another political party should take control of this government. The 30% are without question the families of the ministers and the backbenchers here, and the people who are afraid. You see, 30%, that'll be the rest of the bureaucrats who are afraid to have the light of accountability shone into their departments. The rest of the bureaucrats, the efficient ones, the responsible ones, and there are millions, they're with us. They're with the 70%. The 70% of people in this province have concluded, without the help of the media, that it's time for a change in this province. Anyway, let me get back to this bill. And I want to make a specific reference to the principles that are outlined here in the bill. And it talks about how projects should be prioritized. This is on Section 6 of the legislation. I'm going to read from the bill because I think it's important, again, to emphasize that this is an area that I fully support. I believe my colleagues do as well. And I want to speak to how easily it is to craft legislation that sounds good but is absolutely meaningless. And that's why it's so frustrating for some of us in this place as we stand up to debate legislation. We spend 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour, and essentially we're preaching to the converted here, and the minister knows it's meaningless. Because what he'll do when it's all over is he'll take great pride in having another piece of legislation proclaimed, and nothing else is going to happen. And stakeholders will come forward, as they have already done on many other occasions. Stakeholders are invited to come in to testify at public hearings. And they will come forward and they will make their recommendations in terms of amendments that should be incorporated into this legislation to make it better and to make it practical. And they will take time out of their schedules and to prepare, to come here, to make their presentation, and they will leave, and they will have been ignored. They will have been ignored. Speaker, if you ever took a look and did the analysis, in fact, I've been working with the library and asked them, to do a summary for me over the last 10 years of the number of amendments that have been proposed by the opposition parties on legislation and how many of those amendments were actually incorporated into legislation. It's work in progress, but I can tell you at this point that on average, out of 1,000 amendments, there might be 2 that were actually incorporated into legislation. And members of the government party who sit on standing committees will know that that's a fact, because any observer of standing committees will know that the minute an amendment is read that is proposed by an opposition member of the legislature, you can see the penguins lifting their hands, voting no. They're told you cannot have a mind of your own. Even if a member of a standing committee on the part of the government believes that an amendment is worthwhile, they're not allowed to vote in favor of that amendment. They'd be yanked from their committee appointment, they'd be hauled into the whip's office or the leader's office and disciplined. That's a reality. That's what happens here, and Speaker, you know that. If there's anything we need in this place, it's to actually reinvigorate the process. The process is good. There's nothing wrong with the process. First, second reading, committee. If all of that was allowed to work without the interference, the heavy-handed interference of those who just wanted their way, we would have dynamic government. But we don't. Because the Premier's office, the Whip's office, the Minister's office, they just won't let it happen. It's too threatening to them. And there are consequences to that. In any event, back to the Minister's principles of infrastructure-related requirements. He says that whether the construction of the infrastructure asset would be reasonably expected to, first, have a long-term return on investment, we agree. That it will stimulate productivity and economic competitiveness, we agree. That it will maximize tax assessment values and tax-based growth, we agree. That it will support any other public policy goals of the Government of Ontario or of any affected municipalities in Ontario. I have some question about that. And I'm going to give you one example here where I'm concerned that this statement really has nothing to do with the objective of this plan, but has more to do with accommodating some special interests. There's a reference which on the surface is well-meaning, and that is the requirement that infrastructure projects should engage apprentices. Who could possibly speak about that in principle? Specifically, the legislation states as follows, under Section 8. First of all, it defines apprentice as follows, means an apprentice within the meaning of the Ontario College of Trades and Apprenticeship Act, 2009, and includes any person deemed under that act to be an apprentice for any purpose. So, the definition of an apprentice relates to the meaning of that term under the Ontario College of Trades and Apprenticeship Act. Then it goes on to say, apprentices to be engaged. Quote, the government shall require that such numbers of apprentices as may be prescribed are employed or engaged for the purposes of the construction or of the maintenance by the government of infrastructure assets. Here's why I have serious concerns, and I believe my colleagues in the official opposition have serious concerns about this as well. And I've heard from many stakeholders in the construction trades industry. They want to see this removed, and one of our amendments will deal with that. The concern is that, first of all, the whole debate around the College of Trades issue is one that is highly controversial. Most employers within the construction and trades industry are highly opposed to the bureaucracy that is being created by this government. And we can begin to see already the fault lines in that policy and in that bureaucracy, forcing apprentices, forcing tradesmen into a bureaucratic organization that in the end doesn't benefit them, and it does not benefit the industry, and certainly not the economy. But the point of this clause in this bill, for the government to intervene and to encroach by saying you must hire a certain number of apprentices into a particular project, is the beginning of ensuring that rather than have efficiency in a project, we have a bureaucratic inefficiency. There are going to be contractors who will refuse to bid if, in fact, they will be handcuffed by this clause. This is an area that the government does not need to get involved in. It has nothing whatsoever to do with infrastructure projects and with ensuring that the long-term infrastructure needs of our province are met. And I am going to appeal to the minister to listen, if not to me, but to listen to stakeholders, very serious stakeholders who I know have been making the same point with the minister. This is not something that is essential. Well, the minister is shaking his head, and we'll have some discussion around that. And I'm sure that that the minister will not want to ignore very important stakeholders who have a serious issue with this. So, as I indicate, we have a problem with that particular principle. The fifth principle is quote, provide a foundation for further infrastructure projects. I'm not sure that that means anything, but I think we can support at least 3 out of the 5 principles here, and work with the government to ensure that that we have a good framework brought forward. Now, there's a reference here to consultation. I'll read it. Consultation required before issuing criteria, again under section 6.3. Quote, before issuing criteria under subsection 2, the minister shall consult in the manner that the minister considers appropriate with any persons or bodies that the minister considers appropriate, given the content of the proposed criteria, including any potentially affected ministries, crown agencies, or broader public entities. Now, so the minister is saying in legislation that he'll consult, but he'll only consult with people that he or whoever the subsequent minister is are appropriate. Well, pray tell, who wouldn't be appropriate to consult with in the province of Ontario? If there are stakeholders, if there are people who want to provide input on these criteria, why would anyone be excluded? And yet, we know from experience that that has been the practice of this government. That there are some people that they are pleased to listen to and welcome, and there are others who are excluded from that so-called conversation that the Premier likes to talk about. What we're saying, and what I'd like to say to the Minister, is if you're serious about wanting to get this legislation right, then you won't exclude people from that consultation, and they will be welcome. And we know who you listen to, mostly. But I would ask you to expand the horizon somewhat. And we'll be watching. I'd like to. I referred earlier to a letter that was sent by the leader of the third party to the Premier. Tim Hudak, the leader of the official opposition, sent a letter to the Premier as well, and also sent a letter to the leader of the third party as recently as February the 9th. On January 13th, Tim Hudak announced the Million Jobs Act that will be before this legislature for debate. Tim Hudak spoke about the importance of the economy to the province of Ontario, and if passed, the legislation that he is bringing forward will put people back to work and help young people achieve their goals of employment. He appealed, based on what Statistics Canada showed, that Ontario had lost another 39,000 jobs in December. Speaker, that's Ontario. That's 39,000 jobs lost in just 1 month under the watch of this government. The government payroll, interestingly, increased by 13,000 employees at the same time. What does that tell us? It tells us that the priorities of this government are wrong. They could not be more wrong. And if allowed to continue under this government, we'll continue to see Ontario last. Speaker, I think that it's appropriate to let people know, as they've listened to this debate, that there is hope, that there are alternatives, that it does not have to be this way. And under Tim Hudak and the Progressive Conservative Caucus, there are very crystal clear policies that have been put forward that are in contrast to the current government. Those policies show a path to ensuring the creation of 1 million new jobs. They will ensure energy affordability and reliability. There's a commitment to training more skilled workers to meet the demands in our trades and to help young people find essential jobs. Speaker, there are far too many young people who in past decades would have already been in the workforce, earning a living, taking pride in the work that they're doing. And under the Wynne government, those young people are living in basements with their parents. They're wondering what their future holds. They can't make the car payments. They can't make the car insurance payments. Everything is out of their reach. That's the Ontario that the Wynne, McGuinty Liberals have created. I want the people in this province to know that there is an alternative and there is hope. And it is not under this current government. And it will not be under a new experiment with the New Democrats in this province. We've had that experience under Bob Rae. And unfortunately, there are far too many young people who don't even remember those days. But I ask them to check with their parents because they'll remember well what those days were like. And what we need is a return and a refocus on economic responsibility, on accountability, on transparency in government. A government that actually respects the tax dollars that are sent to Queen's Park every year. A government that will put young people first, a government that will put seniors first. I have a meeting, Speaker, later this week in a retirement home in Newmarket with seniors who have been told that their essential long-term care and home care services are going to be removed from them. They will no longer have the confidence and sense of dignity that they have now because they've been able to rely on in-house service. How can anyone take pride in supporting that kind of policy? I suggest, Speaker, that it is time for a change. And we talk in this bill about hard public infrastructure assets. The government has failed miserably on that count. And we have before us a piece of legislation that is a framework only, that minister after minister have promised to address, and they haven't, and we have no reason to believe that this leper will change its spots. We have no reason to believe that the same people are going to start doing something differently, even in face of an impending election. They can't. It's not who they are. But that's the hard infrastructure assets we're talking about. What is even more important is the devastation that this government has brought to our social services and to the people of our province and the young people of our province and the seniors of our province and the disabled in our province who are also being neglected. And what it's going to take is an absolute change of government, a change of attitude, and it's going to take a group of people who know how important it is that if you're going to look after the social service needs of our province, you must have a strong economy to do that. You cannot continue to borrow our way into debt. That's precisely what's been happening. And the only group of people in this legislature who are offering that kind of solution is the Progressive Conservative Caucus under Tim Hudak. Because it's this caucus that has put forward documentation of policies that will fix the economy, that will restore confidence in our economy, that will attract investment into the economy, that will encourage business owners to reinvest in their business so that they can create the jobs that young people in our province so desperately need. That's only going to come through strong fiscal policy. That's only going to come if we rip out the red tape that is stifling business in this province. And it's only going to come if you can actually demonstrate that you have a vision and a plan to go with that vision. Tim Hudak and the Progressive Conservative Caucus have that plan. And Speaker, I look forward to the next election because that's the only way that there will be hope for the people of this province. Thank you, Speaker.
Questions and comments? The member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to take a couple of minutes just to tap on one aspect of this bill. The minister says it'll make infrastructure projects in the province more transparent in the future. And that'll be a good thing, because we've learned from the Herb Gray Parkway, for example, some of the mistakes in the past. And I know local suppliers in my area aren't being paid.
About the ability of the current government, notwithstanding this piece of legislation, to actually take it to the next step and to implement the policies that are necessary to ensure that the infrastructure deficit in our province is finally addressed. There is also no question in my mind that there is only one government that will have the ability to put in place the economic policies as well as to implement their vision for a better Ontario. And that is the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. I encourage people in the province of Ontario to take note of what their options are. And in my opinion, there is really only one option, and that is Tim Hudak as Premier, the Progressive Conservative Caucus as their government, and that is what will give us a better Ontario. Thank you, Speaker.
Now, read it.
Further debate? Further debate? The member for Windsor